The Visiting Artist Program, funded by PAFA's graduate program, brings an outstanding roster of local, national, and international artists to PAFA each semester for lectures, critiques, and workshops. The program exposes students and the public to a range of artistic approaches and fosters discussion about contemporary art and ideas. This afternoon, we are pleased to have D'Angelo Lovell Williams joining us. D'Angelo Lovell Williams is a Black HIV-positive artist expanding narratives of Black and queer intimacy through photography. They earned their BFA in photography from Memphis College of Art in 2015, an MFA in photography from Syracuse University in 2018, and are a 2018 Skowhegan School of Art alum. They live and work in New York City. D'Angelo has 4 solo exhibitions with Higher Pictures and curated the 2021 exhibition, We Wear the Mask at Higher Pictures Generation. D'Angelo has exhibited at LACMA, Gallery 400, MF Projects, Cleveland Museum of Art, Tone Memphis, LACMA Gallery, WPA, OSilas Gallery, Lehman College Art Gallery, and FJORD Gallery. Their work can be seen in the New Yorker, New York Times, the 1619 Project, The Bitter Southerner, Vanity Fair, Financial Times, DAZED, Out, and Vice. D'Angelo is currently an artist in residence at the Sharpe-Walentas Studio Program in DUMBO through August 2022. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to D'Angelo. You may now begin sharing your screen.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Such a pleasure. I went to Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art a few years ago, maybe 2019. There was a thesis exhibition going on, and someone that I hadn't met yet was showing in the show, the thesis show, and like it was great to just see the work that had been made there. But I haven't been back since, and it's great to be doing this as another opportunity to visit with members of the PAFA community. But yes, I will be showing you a great deal of work just throughout when I started thinking about self-portraiture and what I'm doing now. So I got my start very early just as an artist, and I had always wanted to be an artist since I was a child, and I was always drawing and coloring, and went through performing in visual arts programs, and that's when I kind of expanded outside of the sort of ideas of wanting to animate, and I started to draw from real life. I started to paint and sculpt and make ceramics and do all of these other things, which I enjoyed very much, but I was broken from drawing from things that weren't real, and that kind of changed my perception of like what I saw around me, how I like translated my life into art. And I got these ideas when I got in high school of, you know, taking my first class in photography, and it was black and white. And I really didn't. Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt, but your presentation isn't in presentation mode yet. So all of the images aren't as large as they could be.
Let's see. So should I just use the slideshow?
Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I don't have to do the presenter thing. But yeah, so I took my first photo class in high school, and it really didn't grasp me, but I had the opportunity to take this sort of digital photography class my junior year, and that kind of is where photography began to take have its hold on me. I was making images of my friends and just making all of these surreal things, getting back to this sort of imaginative mode of making images. They were all very shitty, heavily photoshopped images of my friends. Wish I had those to show you. But I had to make the decision of where I wanted to go to college and further my education. And I wanted to definitely go to an art school. So when I got to Memphis College of Art, it was, what would be my major. It wasn't necessarily, me thinking it would be photo right away, but it was like, okay, I love painting and sculpting also, but photography seemed to be what, would get my ideas across much easily and faster, quicker. Photography is a very quick medium, and it's just, I've taken, I've just taken it as far as I've, come today. So the work that I started making in undergrad, it was very much about my own body, my own relationship to the world outside of me, in media and things that I saw, like films, books. But it was also about me growing up just throughout my adolescence and middle school and high school, and kind of like looking back on these different sort of interactions I had in school, just feeling constricted, knowing I was always gay and or queer, and didn't necessarily, want to talk about that, know how to like express that without feeling that I'd be, anything, a number of things could have happened, but I didn't come out until grad school. And the work that I was making in undergrad kind of reflected what my thinking was of how to get around these sort of, saying that I'm gay, I'm making, these things just because I felt this way in high school and middle school. But the images that I started making with my friends were more so about the constriction of the body, not necessarily my own body, but in general. And I didn't realize at the time that I was making a lot of work that kind of not just the restriction of the body also, but just like the restriction of the mind, and how limited it could be to be an individual. So I was making a lot of images that, I was wearing clothes that I, thought wouldn't get me talked about in high school. Like, there's a lot of conformity, middle school and high school. So, I started making images about sneakerhead culture because it was something that kind of got to me, and I felt like I had to conform to a lot of, societal norms. And I made this work thinking, well, I'm going to be very literal, but it was, with shoes that I had just growing up collecting. I loved Jordans, and it was a way for me to kind of like express these things in a more colorful, beautiful way than it felt. My relation towards just growing up in public school systems in Jackson, Mississippi. And it was not, it was not easy, just like even making certain images to talk about conformity or identity, because I didn't really have one. It was like, how do I make this? It's coming from thin air. And while I was making these images, these sort of self-portraits, which did start out with my white friends that I, had in Memphis, early on when I got there, it was like I was using their bodies to talk about my own experiences, and I didn't think that that was something I wanted to continue doing. And I was also, meeting other photographers, some who were having some success in, who and what they were photographing. And I met this photographer living in Memphis, Wynton Sabatini, who was making images of Black people, Black youth in Memphis. And I got inspired to do that as well. I wasn't bringing this work into class. I was, forcing myself to just like go out in different neighborhoods in Memphis and just like photograph strangers. It started out as a class assignment to photograph strangers, but we had to find a group to photograph for the semester. And I ended up photographing this photographer, Wynton Sabatini, and his roommates for the semester, all white. And it was a whole thing. It was like a very, very fratty time in my life. But I started to photograph, the Black community in Memphis. And I found me searching for this sort of connection, this missing connection that I didn't feel like I had with my own people. And I wasn't, it was a lot of challenges to just like, kind of insert myself into a place that I wasn't really familiar with and try to get to know in my own way, but really trying to become a part of a larger community that I didn't necessarily know I had this sort of freedom to explore, because I mean, it was mine, but there was like, it wasn't really reflective of me being in art school, me, making things that were in conversation with my own history at the time, or environment. But I started to try to put more of myself, this sort of softer feeling. When I made the series Beauty Kings, I was wrapping men's heads in fabric. I was photographing men, women, and children at first, but then I was like, okay, I only want to photograph Black male youth and people around my age, basically. And I mean, I photographed some older men as well, but I was more connected to Black youth at the time. And I wanted to sort of make Black men beautiful. So I made this series, it became my thesis work. It was a challenge doing this with strangers. I mean, it was already a challenge just photographing strangers when they asked, like, why you want to photograph me? What are these images for? And I'd have to just like be, just straight up, I'm a student, I'm making this for a class. But it got much harder when I wanted to wrap fabric around, these presumably straight men's heads. And of course I couldn't tell, but I wasn't trying to be like, oh yeah, I'm, gay, I'm queer, I'm wanting to make this work, I'm wanting to make you look beautiful. And it just became like, how do I, reach out to this community and then pull something out of it that feels like me. And I started to make this with my friends that I had made in Memphis. And it was, it was important for me to do this with friends because there was already this sort of connection of intimacy and not solely being easier, but it just felt right. Even though, I mean, I had photographed myself a little bit at this time, but not, anywhere near what I've done up to this point. But there was some groundwork that was laid of how I might want to continue photographing myself. But I just, thought that I would continue doing this work into grad school. When I got to Syracuse, it was like, I was forced to apply to grad schools, Fulbright, and of course shows in undergrad, which like set us up for some opportunities, after we were done. And I didn't want to like start working right away. So I applied to some grad schools, and I chose Syracuse. And it was like a lot of firsts for me, like being out as a 23-year-old person finally, and in Syracuse of all places as a start. And it took a little bit, a few months, but I started to, think about what I wanted to do, and I started photographing strangers in Syracuse as well. It didn't really feel like I wanted to continue to do that. I didn't feel like it was me. I didn't feel like, it was right. So I started making these self-portraits that were kind of looking at these sort of relationships between what is worn on the body, all of these very basic elements of, art, color, shape, texture, all of the, motifs. And I wanted to sort of make these visually stimulating images that kind of overlooked, gender norms and me, I'm not this, thin person and had always grown up a bigger body person and still have this mindset of, well, the bodies of Black men that I see are all, the same, and they're all muscular, they're all, these models, perfected bodies. And that was kind of like, I mean, it was, interesting to see how Black people in general were portrayed throughout history. And I wanted to sort of, reach into that history, find my own place in it, and then bring this imagery that was like, well, this is what is possible when you imagine something more, when you don't stigmatize, when you don't limit the bodies that are, desired in whatever it is. I mean, books, film, music even is just like, it's all very specific into, who's successful, why they're successful at it. And it all comes down to like what we desire. So I was making, these images with my own body that kind of, they touch on these different experiences that I was having growing up. For example, in the church, this image here is titled On Sundays I Was a No-Show, which is, talking about the sort of relationship of being forced to go to church, not really feeling it. It's just not my thing. But it's also just like the sort of inherent religion that this inherent relationship that Black people have with spirituality, religion, that really is meant to take its own form, I feel. And I kind of, touched on that in making some of these images, just the different things that we go through and we all have our own experiences with. This image is called Blow. And I like to have these sort of, multi-layered references. This is, an image that's meant to be as sexual as it is violent, or sort of kind of like reflecting how the two can interact with each other. I've seen, men suck on guns in movies like Spring Breakers or music videos as an act of pleasure, but it's also an act of violence. It's about this sort of oral fixation, this pleasure, but it's also about, like mental health. And, I don't know who, it's like, you really never know like what someone is thinking until it's, too late. But, I've had, thoughts of, why am I here? What am I doing? I don't want to be this, person that's, like not uplifted and supported in this world. And it was just like, I would rather make images about what that feels like as opposed to, ending it all, for example. But this is an image where I was like, I have the power over my own life. And a lot of my image making has been about taking back, reclaiming my own narratives, power, just in general, just like when I see a lot of images of Black people, not by Black people, it is really this sort of disconnect automatically, because it's like, is the person who's making the images living the experience of the people that they're photographing? So a lot of my image making was about, what it was like, but also what is imagined. I was also having my first real intimate experiences with other Black queer people. And that kind of like, took a while for me to figure out how to insert that into my work. Like a lot of my early work in undergrad was very solo, just like very, I remember at the end of my first year of grad school, it was a 3-year program. It was, did I freeze? Okay. There was a end of the year critique, and it's with the 4 grad professors, and then we have a visiting artist. But the 4 grad professors, at the end of my studio visit with them, were like, your work has become too pretty, too perfect. And, we want you to sort of get dirty, get gritty. And I was like, they were like, you've done this, to the T, like, what else can you do? So it was like, my thinking was like, why would they say this work is too perfect and expect me to not continue it? But it was like, I also have to look at it as a way for me to expand on what, the work looks like moving forward. An example here was just like, they wanted me to change, my lighting, emote more, like basically sort of become this sort of more rounded, more dynamic image maker. And I was doing a number of things. Like, I tried to introduce other people into the work. I didn't feel like it worked then necessarily, so I continued making self-portraits, but I hadn't really photographed a lot in domestic or the landscape, outdoors, and that was like more of a challenge for me. So that became like, my intent, like, use more sunlight and flash, introduce more people into the work, and kind of like get to this place where the work feels more dynamic, basically. This image here, a lot of the time I, was winging how I made images, which I mean still can work, but it was just like, I ended up finding it easier to make sketches, to draw out what I want to happen in the work, or write down sentences of what I would like to happen. But also it was just like, even if I did that, it wouldn't necessarily be the same way that an image played out. Anything could change, but for the most part, that was like how I got my ideas out. But yeah, so I was, making images on the road, which was just sort of this exploratory and freeing thing, just like being out of Syracuse when it's like cold and snowy for most of the year. It's like, where do I make this work that I'm wanting to expand into? And like the opportunities came in traveling. This image is made in Memphis on a road trip, visiting my undergrad and friends who were getting married. But it's like, I was continuing and also just still finding my footing, just making these very slyly sexual images, but also just like, showing my own body, identifying as male at the time. I identify as non-binary at this point, but I was making these sort of images that were saying I'm desirable, I'm sexy, I'm, in control, I'm offering. But also just like the environment, the setup, the colors. I wanted this sort of aesthetic that I didn't know I wanted, but it was like, all of these things came together and became the work. And it was like, a lot of looking at myself in a way that I didn't feel was documentary. It was anytime I was in the image, which was probably 95% of the time, I was like, I'm becoming a character. And it was a way for me to take myself out of the work. I never wear my glasses in my work, for example, and I'm like, that's me, but it's not me. And even now, like, not saying that everyone in the world knows my work, but it's like people still don't think that I'm in my work. I don't know if it's because people know what I look like, but it's like, people can't tell that it's me sometimes, and I'm like, it's mostly all me. But and I was photographing my body changes, just, that was a big part of, what I started doing also, was just like looking at my own body and photographing it in many different ways, from the inside out, if that makes sense, or just trying to like pull things that were not just, on the surface, on the outside in this sort of visually stimulating way. But a lot of the work was definitely grappling with race and being in different communities, the Black community, the queer community, and how they were combative at times, finding my place in Syracuse as well in this. And also just like still having these sort of experiences that reflected the work I was making. This image, for example, was made after where was that? There was a club in Miami. I forget the name of the club, but there was a terror attack, and 49 people were killed in the club. And it was sort of this reflection on being in that space and entering spaces like it, just, anywhere, thinking that something like this could happen. But I wanted to kind of capture like what these sort of moments of, stillness and not necessarily presumably joy, but when you go to certain places, you don't expect for certain things to happen. But it's also just like, these moments, I'm sure people are trying to make beautiful moments in whatever, situation they enter usually. So it was about that energy of entering somewhere and knowing that you wanted to have this sort of pleasant time, but also knowing that there are so many different things that are, in the world that could hurt you at any moment. And it was also just, at this time I was kind of understanding like what it meant to kind of like create a narrative from not necessarily from nothing, but it was, I was so used to churning out series in undergrad like every week. So it was kind of like, I didn't feel burned out, but it was like a lot of ideas just being visualized in different ways. And that's nowhere near how I work now. I go months without making work. I mean, even in grad school, like we had a month to make work for critiques. And it was just like, what do I do with all this time? And it's literally me making work at the last minute, but also just like waiting for the right moments, not trying to force anything. So a lot of these narratives were these sort of kind of like historical references, going back to slave references, or just sort of these, a lot of my references are from history, but they're also from music and film, titles, my own experiences as well. But for example, here, this image is called Structural Dishonesty. And that is a reference to, history, the patriarchy, and also this sort of idea that we were sort of taken out of, as Black people, we were taken out of this environment where we were thriving and then placed into another one where we also ended up, making our own way and surviving and being this sort of making something out of nothing, but also just being inherently, as innovative as we could to survive, whether that was like, using every part of, the leftover food that slaves were given to eat a meal. And it's like, I still, knowing I'm from Jackson, Mississippi, I've like eaten so many different things. But it's like, there's so much history, not just with food, not just with music or, writing, that is so rich and overlooked, and not necessarily, a lot of people don't get to see that, these different reflections on that history kind of like presented to a larger world. A lot of people don't know that that's what they want to do, but making images that kind of like are in conversation with history, in conversation with how the Black body has been seen, just throughout that history, and also how to kind of like communicate with with multiple communities is what I was thinking. Is like, a larger conversation is, we know these things are stigmatized. We know these things aren't talked about for reasons. A lot of, people don't want to be held accountable for their own histories or for their own, actions. And I was trying to do a lot of that with this work. Just, when you realize you don't see any white people in this work, it's like, there's a reason for that. And when you realize that you don't see yourself in this work, there's a reason for that. And if you do, you do. But it's like, I want you to be in this space where, okay, where am I in this work? And if you don't see yourself, you know, you have to ask yourself why that is. And what I wanted to do was sort of bring these like really, really disgusting topics to some people and sort of make them beautiful. This image here is called Face Down, Ass Up, music reference, but also just like a sexual reference. And it was based on an experience that I had that wasn't like violent or anything, but it was just like, you know, it happened. And I mean, I got carried away with it, but it was just like, you know, it was also a reference to these images that I had seen of this line of Black men on a wall. I don't know where exactly it was, but there were police sort of searching the men. They were all in their underwear. I don't know the name of the photographer, but it was like, you know, that was sort of this image where I'm like, okay, this is very, one, horrible and disrespectful, but it's, you know, a thing that many Black people have gone through. Not just Black people, but it's just, you know, that sort of relationship with my own history kind of like led to this moment to talk about, you know, the body, mine specifically, but also just like how our bodies are sometimes not our own. In the case with that image of the Black men lined up on the wall, I was out to my family then. At this point, not everyone, just like my mom knew. I was slowly coming out to my dad, who had like prodded all my life but never asked. And we've had a up and down relationship. We're on good terms, but it's like, you know, it was a very slow introduction to including family in the work, which you'll see later. But I was making these sort of images that was reflective of different moments where, you know, for example, I'd be at my grandmother's house on the couch late night and I'm watching something I shouldn't be on, you know, the TV. And I'm thinking, everyone's gone to bed. And then I feel like I see someone watching me, like doing something I'm not supposed to do, but it's really just my imagination, imagining them there. So I made, you know, this image to sort of talk about feeling like you're being watched while you're doing something, but it's really just all in your head. This image was titled Homecoming, this sort of, you know, me being home, the idea of coming. Also, this picture in the back is an image of my mother at her, in high school. She was the first Black homecoming queen at her high school. And that's an image in promotion of that. But it was a way for me to, you know, kind of talk about this multi-layering of who I am as a person, who my mother was as a person in high school, and just like sort of thinking about these relationships amongst family that a lot of people don't have, especially if they're queer. And it was just like very, very, it was a challenge to sort of make a lot of images that were very heavily focused on race and sex and gender, and but it felt like it needed to be done regardless of, you know, who didn't like the work, regardless of whether or not my parents, you know, did or didn't like the work. And they do, they're like very supportive of me. But like a lot of people don't have that. And that is the bigger issue. A lot of people don't have images to look at to be like, hey, this is how I feel, or this is, you know, how I felt at 12 when, you know, I wasn't sure if I was gay or not, or if I was, but I wasn't able to express any of that. So a lot of my image making had revolved around this sort of back and forth of, you know, trying to look at all of these moments in my life, have new experiences, and sort of like be more ingrained in this reality, but also, you know, a hint of surrealism here and there. But it was definitely something that I thought was less of a challenge when I was entering the sort of headspace of not really getting what I want from, you know, showing this work in my grad crits. It was like I had to form my own language. I had to form my own sort of like how I wanted my work to be talked about, presented, because I wasn't getting much from my grad peers or professors. It was a lot of me going outside of the grad school photo community and like looking for what I want and asking, you know, seeing, like doing my own research outside of the research that I was doing in school. And it was definitely easier to include images of myself and make images with friends that I'd made. It was still like very, very early when I was introducing other people into the work, because not everyone that I was making images with, you know, I had a sexual relationship with, or, you know, I knew well, but it was just like, you know, the important part was what were the intimate moments that, you know, weren't sexual that could be captured, because a lot of people would look at this work and be like, oh, you're just, you know, making these images of, you know, like these very sexual experiences, which is on the verge of porn. And there was nowhere near, like, you know, there's the idea that intimacy is always sexual, and it's not. So that's what I was trying to get at with a lot of the images that I was making in grad school. And of course, it was just like, you know, I wasn't thinking of how I could sort of translate my work into this for sale, since, like, you know, I wasn't making any editorial work or didn't think I was. But it was like, you know, some of these images feel that way. But it was like it took a while for me to kind of like direct my work into that way. So, you know, people would reach out for me to do editorial work because they like the work that I do. I mean, even then, there's always something new that's created. A lot of, you know, editors who reach out to artists to sort of bring their own flair to something want them to do that, but that's not necessarily what always happens. But in some cases it does, which is always great either way. But I was wanting to sort of talk about things that I enjoyed, but were like, you know, it was like I wanted these sort of feelings of like bodies touching bodies. And I made this image here. There's always something about the pressure. I enjoyed like just growing up and having like, it didn't happen all the time, but like a person stepping on my back. And I just thought that it was like a very visceral way to talk about intimacy, like with any part of the body touching any part of the body. And I was looking at it as the sort of scientific interaction, chemical reaction, but with bodies, not chemicals. This is from my first show with Higher Pictures Generation, Higher Pictures at the time, but I was offered this show a few weeks after meeting with Kim Boris, who owns Higher Pictures Generation, and she came to Syracuse for one of our grad critiques, and with no intent of giving anyone a show, and the professors, you know, had known that they wanted to bring her in the past 10 years. She gave Latoya Ruby Frazier her first show. And it was like, you know, I was such the rebel student. They were like, the professors were like, we don't think any of these grad students are ready. And then Kim was like, Well, why not? They were like, we don't think anyone should have a show while they're in grad school. And she was like, well, why not? I don't agree. But she basically likes my work, told me to stay in touch. And then a few weeks later offered me, you know, to come to her gallery, show her some prints. And then she offered me the show. And I've been showing with her since then. But it was like, you know, a lot of new things, just like coming to terms with being in that space while still in grad school, but also just like in general, not knowing where it would go, but it kind of, you know, affected how I existed in school. Just like I was ready to be done with school. You know, it was my second year at the point where I was, you know, about to have the show. That was really big for me. And I'm still in grad school, so having to show work I'm working on, but it's like I'm being treated differently because, you know, I'm making these images that I care about, but I don't really like get what I want in showing them. So like, why show them? Like images I've made in the past, Blow, for example, or Face Down, Ass Up, were images where like people either said nothing about, hate that something like that happened, or they started to cry. And I'm just like, well, all of that is like, I mean, it's great when people have these sort of emotional connections to the work, but it's like you're crying for the wrong reason, or you're like, you feel how you feel about whatever it is. But Black people in general go through things so often, and it's like we don't have the time to like sit in a lot of the feelings that we have, a lot of experiences that we have, because we have to keep going, keep pushing to survive. And I had the opportunity to go to Berlin for a semester, my last year of grad school. And it was great because I wasn't having to, you know, be in, you know, grad crits in Syracuse, and I was in a different environment, a whole country for the first time. I actually had my first experience flying while in grad school on a trip to Venice, Italy for the Venice Biennale. This was the summer before I went to Berlin. But it was just like a lot of firsts that year, having this first show with high pictures, flying for the first time, being in another country for the first time. And I'm like, you know, knowing I'm going to, I mean, when I was in Italy, it was just like looking at the Biennale for like 9 hours a day, every day for 2 weeks. And it was very overwhelming, but it was very great to see all these different types of art. In Berlin, it was like a 3-month-long residency. So I'm like, you know, in another place, having to find things to photograph. I have a studio. It was this larger, I mean, it was a 4-person sort of independent study, but it was a residency program for the grad students, 2 photo grad students and 2 sculpture grad students. And it was a whirlwind, just like being in this place and, you know, not knowing what the fuck to do. But I had some suggestions of these groups to follow in Facebook, the Black Berlin group, which led me to all of these different resources of like other Black people in Berlin, natives and some Americans who have been living there or visiting, and they all come together. They, you know, are a mixture of musicians, writers, poets, filmmakers, curators, people in tech, comedians. And it was just like a very beautiful way to like be in a community in such a very racially tense place in all aspects of the word. Like I go into a spot cast, a bodega in Berlin, and then, you know, like I'm pulled out, dragged out because I'm holding the door looking at the beers open for too long. And the person who's working at the store is frustrated that I'm doing that. Or I'm in a club and someone thinks it's okay to like touch my body, or I'm in a like at a show or somebody thinks it's okay to touch my body, it's like I was experiencing all of these different things there that were very different than being an American in America in spaces that were similar. There was this sort of different experience with my own body in a place like Berlin. But I did find enjoyment in making images with some of the people that I had become friends with there. And it was, I mean, it was still a challenge because I wasn't photographing in a way that I had been in grad or in Syracuse or many of the other places that were like, you know, involved romantic interests or friends that I knew longer or better. So like what came out of these images was very important also because it was just a different way of working. Excuse me, a different way of working and seeing, you know, Black people just like leisurely. That was like, you know, no one has to be doing anything important or dramatic to be seen, to be important, was my thinking. Like I was thinking about all of these different gestures that were very simple that kind of talked about one, these sort of feelings that I was having in Berlin, but also just a larger idea of how am I sort of presenting these narratives in another place. And like a lot of the challenge was to try to like recreate the same thing over and over and over again, but that's not what I wanted to do. It was like, you know, I want something different. There's always going to be a different feeling in the work. And that, I mean, there are things that tie the work together, but there are also things that, you know, one makes it very hard for a lot of, you know, this work to be, or for me, it was hard for a lot of this work to be seen together. In talks with some of the grad professors, they were suggesting ways of showing this work, maybe like in acts, like act 1, act 2, act 3, this sort of like acting thematic. And I thought about it, it was like interesting because I'm like essentially becoming characters in this work, but it wasn't, you know, I'm still very much in the work. I'm not calling it documentary, but it's still a document of sorts, although staged. Like all the images are staged, but there are definitely moments where I'm putting, you know, these lived experiences, these imagined experiences there, which is all staging. I like to say that I'm an image maker. I don't like to say I take pictures because they really wouldn't have existed if I didn't like make the thing look how it looked or into what it is. But yeah, like a lot of the images also were not just of people who were out, but people who didn't want to be seen. So it's like, how do you photograph someone who doesn't want to be seen? But you want people to see them. And it's like, you know, this back and forth about what you want versus what other people want. Like, I've said many times that I make this work for Black people, Black queer people. But like, a lot of Black people might not be into this work. A lot of, you know, who the work is for might not see the work. I want, you know, children to see my work. And it's not the case where this work is going to be talked about, you know, in grade school. It's not, you know, when my book comes out, that book is probably not going to reach, you know, elementary, middle school classes, but it's like, the idea is that it's there for when a person, you know, needs it, is looking for themselves. So like, that's how I was thinking of this sort of building of this, I guess, an archive in a way. I mean, it's an archive, but I don't really label it that, see it as that. But it's a part of history nonetheless. And a lot of the references are very specific to collective moments, like this image here. Glory Hole is an image where I'm talking about how it feels to be Black and gay in America. It's kind of, I mean, a lot of my images have been literal at times. It's something that I've like, not necessarily struggled with, but been okay with, but also just like, you know I can go in and out of these things, these moments of being very specific and literal to like being more abstract, which I find is a very pleasant space, just like in having other people make up the things that are in something that I've done. But this image here was like, I want to put my dick through the flag because I don't care about the flag at all. It doesn't represent me. It barely represents, this country. But also it's very in line with a lot of people's experiences when they, feel like they're heavily sexualized in the gay community or heavily profiled in, America and society. And it was like, there are so many different things that the images visually don't visually reference right away, but like all of those connectors to other experiences are there inherently. For example, this image is called Cheek to Cheek. The titles are, not all of them are funny or just like cheeky like that, but I feel like they're more direct than the images at times, which I like. I love it. Yeah, so that was the end of grad school, and I found myself like in another place, just mentally, physically. I was leaving Syracuse. I had nowhere to live really. I mean, I, had some setups. Like I did the Skowhegan residency, which is a 9-week long residency. And it's a whole thing, just like mentally, one, and physically. But I didn't really want to make work in that environment. Right away, it was like I didn't make work until the last minute. A few weeks left to go in the residency, but I ended up photographing other queer Black artists that were there with me, and we couldn't bring anyone from outside of the residency onto the residency campus, which was a challenge, but I was also in Portland, Maine, so there weren't many other gay Black people living there. But I was able to meet this young aspiring model who lives like 25 minutes away, and photographed him outside the residency, photographed us outside of the residency, like across the street. But like the images that I were making were very much sort of continuing this visual language, finding myself in the landscape more. This place was 600 acres of land, and most of that was accessible. But for the most part at Skowhegan, I was just drinking and smoking every day, in my hammock every day, and just like, I was having these sort of supernatural experiences. A lot of people do there. Some people don't believe that it is a thing there, but it is native land, like Native American land, and has a very rich history. So that is what it is. But I was having these sort of out of body experiences, just like at times. I don't know if I was like too high or drunk, but it was just like I was visually seeing and feeling this sort of pixelation that is stay with me. And I don't always like, I haven't been necessarily set on reflecting that, but it changed the way that I thought about making images. I started like merging bodies together, 2 or 3 bodies to like make this larger entity. And also still seeing the image as like this visual language, and gesture, and like kind of course, still referencing all of these different things. Like here, for example, I'm thinking of what it would be like if there was a Black queer music group, just like in history, 50s, 60s, sort of in the vein of Destiny's Child, and the outfits are same but different, because we don't have that, and again, it's like what do I want to see exist for a generation that is coming after me, but also like what do I want for who is here. And it's like it goes back to this sort of idea of leisure and entertainment and being a community. That is sort of like where a lot of the ideas thrive. But these are 2 of the other artists who are at Skowhegan with me, Jarvis Boyland and Cameron Claiborne. And we became this music group, for example. I was very happy to be in a place where I could like get all of these sort of environmental images, being in the water, the image that I showed earlier of me in the yellow, in the water was kind of like the first image where I sort of was able to kind of like feel the sort of presence of my ancestors, but I didn't have that language at the time. But being able to, like make an image like this, just knowing that, okay, I'm in a body of water. It's not necessarily the Atlantic, but it's like, what, would, my Igbo ancestors, what were their thoughts like, as they jumped from the slave ships because they didn't want to come to America to be slaves. Like the act of saying no, kind of like directing your own freedom, was like my thinking in making this image titled Nah. Very, very short and sweet title. It's an example of this sort of merging that I started to do. I'm thinking like this is, the continuation of one body, but it's 2 bodies. It's also this idea of you can't see what, this one presumed body is doing in front of the other person. They could be lying down, they could be giving them head. Like I wanted all of these different kind of thoughts to go through someone's head. Also like showing this sort of vast landscape that's free of like the sort of city living. And I've kind of like kept that with me, just like I would like to visit the landscape of Skowhegan again, but the residency was the whole thing. And that's like, it'll take a while. It's been like almost 4 years, but I haven't been back since. I, left the residency, had to figure out where I wanted to live because I didn't have a home still, but I had left some things in a friend's basement. A friend of mine, Whitleen Cadet, it's one of her images here, who was at Skowhegan with me. And we were also at Syracuse together. I was in my last year when she was in her first year, but I left some things in her basement and they got destroyed during the summer in Syracuse. So I had nothing, but had to start over. And I was thinking of moving to New York City. It wasn't something that I wanted to do right away, but it was a thought. But Kim Boris of Higher Pictures was like, maybe you should go to LA, see how you like it. So I did. I was only supposed to be there for a month and I ended up being there for 6 months. Ended up dating someone, Diedrich Brackens, this artist photographed here. And it kind of like not right away, but it slowly entered that. And it was me wanting to sort of like build images around that relationship, my first romantic relationship, serious relationship that I'd never had before. And that was a challenge in itself, but it was like, still, it was something that I couldn't expect to do, especially, seeing people make images of their partners and like running with that, and then their partner, agreeing to that, but then being in a position where at the time my partner didn't want to be in all of my images. And I'm like, well, I guess it is okay for me to still make these sort of intimate and sexually intimate without the sex images with other people. It was just like a lot of new experiences or ways of making images that I, just had to be okay with, but just had to also understand how to like continue making, even though I was in a more serious relationship. So it was a lot of this sort of almost sexual, but not kind of images. But the narratives were more, I was trying to like make these sort of horror-based images, or what I thought was horror. This image here was the first time I tried this sort of gum stretching from one person's mouth to another person, my mouth. But it wasn't, the gum isn't in my mouth. And you'll see later where I remake this image with my mom. And a lot of what I started doing was sort of looking at, again, wanting the scientific approach where I look at, or the Black bodies in the work are looking at each other's bodies, dissecting each other's bodies, and still like this sort of merging of one body part with the other without any kind of like Photoshop or manipulation, to look like a body, a language, a sentence, a word, a paragraph. Yeah, so it was like me being out of school and finding my footing, which, in having the sort of community, a good photo community, one, but also, I mean, LA wasn't the place for me socially, but the friends that I did make, the people that I did photograph, were very important in that process, the image making process. One was the person I was dating, but also other people who were also Libras, like me. Clifford Prince King, who was here, is a photo-based, an LA-based photographer. And we made a lot of images together. I'm in Clifford's work, Clifford's in my work. This image here, the idea was originally for Clifford to be on my shoulders and the dress to cover us both, but the dress was too short. And then this is what we ended up doing. I wanted this idea of a man becoming pregnant, but not necessarily going through the process of pregnancy, or like looking like it was an actual person. I wanted this sort of alien-like body, or this sort of morphing, birthing body, but it's like an adult. And I've thought about making this image in many ways, but this was like, I don't think I could have made this image with many other people. For example, a non-Libra, but and also Carice here, who's a musician, is also a Libra. So it's just like, Carice was my roommate for a few months. I moved to 3 different places while I lived in LA over the 6 months I was there, and it was a lot. But like the images that I made were some of the more like slowed down, intimate images, because I wasn't making images for school. I wasn't making images for, really anything. And I was making them at my own pace. It was like, now I'm self-guided, and then it was a lot of that.
D'Angelo, I don't mean to interrupt, but we are getting a little close on our time limit.
Okay.
So yeah,
yeah.
if you want to talk for a few more minutes and then we
Yeah.
can save room for some questions.
Okay. But yeah, so I was, one, over being in LA. I wanted to make it work there, but it just didn't make sense for me to be there. I love making my work there. It's one of the best parts of being in LA is the landscape. There are a lot of places where nothing really looks like LA. But that kind of like expanded my, the way that I work, because I had access to all of this land that wasn't New York, where it became a challenge to photograph here in New York due to weather. But this image here with my mother is, one of the first times I introduced family seriously into the work. Photographed my mother, my grandmother, and who just passed in September. So it was really important to like have this sort of sense of who I am, where I came from, be a part of the work. I have plans to photograph family more intently and more in-depthly, but it'll come in time. Yeah, a lot of these images were sort of me looking at all of the connections between family, friends, lovers, in this sort of kindred ancestral way. And that like led me to how I think about spirituality in the work, and like who allows me to photograph them. I mean, I only photograph people that I know, but also, or when I'm not getting paid, but editorial work has become a part of, this sort of expansion into my image making world. I get to still make work while marinating on images that I'm thinking for my own work. This image is of my father and I, titled Daddy Issues. Not necessarily something that we've actually done in real life, but it was like a way to talk about this sort of back and forth we've gone through over the years. He's happy to be in my work. He loves being in my work. Still has, how he feels about me being gay, but it's all a joke to him in ways, but he jokes about it. It's not all a joke. He knows I'm very successful at, what I'm doing, and is happy to be a part of it all. But yeah, I'll just go through these. And a lot of the people that I've photographed have kind of, I mean, it's nice to be able to photograph changes in, people's lives. I photographed friends who weren't trans when I photographed them, but, whether or not they knew it then, it's just like, they now identify as trans men and women, men and women in general. And yeah, so it's definitely, been a lot over the past, almost 5 years, 4 years since I started showing with Higher Pictures, and sort of like finding my own voice as an artist, and also like knowing all of the things that I love: music, film, writing, just expanding into all of those different areas, visually and just like, mentally. Like writing about this work is very important. These are some editorial images that I've made in the past year. Yeah, it's like, I'm at a place right now where I'm in this year-long residency and I'm working on many different things. One for a show, but I'm making drawings, I'm making weavings. I am doing a lot of the things that I've been thinking of doing for years, but haven't had the space or resources to do them. And it's been nice. It's like, me having to be like, this is my schedule, because
I literally never have a schedule. But it's nice when things come along and I can sort of attribute what I do around, other people's time. But it's nice not being bombarded with, editorial work either. But it's nice that it happens every now and then. Sam Gilliam, that was Spike Lee before. Danelle Padilla-Peralta for the New York Times. Mothers of Black men killed for Vanity Fair. With Love back in September. And some other images within the past year, Friends. And thank you all for your time.
Thank you. Wow, that was amazing. So much depth and variety.
Yeah, I'm just like that. I mean, a lot of people haven't seen a lot of my work, so it's it's nice to be working on this book with Mac that'll like have some of that work in it, but there's still so much more that's like has not been seen.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Of course. Thank you all for having me. Yeah.
Of course. I'll go ahead and do, I think we'll have time for about 2 questions.
Okay.
So I'll go with the first one from Sam.
Should I stop the share?
Yeah, if you want to, or you can keep one up, whichever you prefer.
Well, yeah, because there might be questions about
yeah, either one, whichever you prefer.
Cool.
The first question is, I was wondering if you could speak to how you entered into editorial work and how that might have affected your personal work or vice versa.
What was my first? Well, it was a matter of people reaching out to me. It was usually the case, like right after grad school, I was set on like starting to do editorial work because I was like, okay, money. And also like there was a lot that I didn't know, like I didn't know where I was gonna live because I was leaving Syracuse, but I knew I needed to make money because Syracuse wasn't paying me to be a TA anymore. But I did a lot of like reaching out personally to people who gave me their cards from studio visits, editors from like the New Yorker. I had people's emails from just visits or found their emails online, and I reached out to many different people for teaching jobs, editorial jobs, and like none of them wanted anything to do with me. I mean, I say it like that, but it felt like that because like I didn't start making editorial work for like 2 years. Like literally 2020 was when I got my first editorial job. It's 2 years after grad school. And reaching out felt like the right thing to do, like asking for work, but it wasn't, how people usually went about giving opportunities to people, which I knew, like a lot of people want to give things to their friends, people they know, people who, they met personally, and not, someone asking them to give them something. But I literally just took that opportunity to continue making the work, which ended up being what led to, me being given the opportunity to do this story on Black Visions Collective, who are here. This was my first editorial job for the New York Times Magazine. And it was like it wasn't stated how long it would be, but it was a week-long job in Minneapolis. My friend Rashad, who was also my photo assistant, went with me, and then we spent 4 or 5 out of the 7 days photographing the Black Visions Collective founders, and then community members and the collective members as well for the New York Times story. But it was like, that being my first sort of editorial job, it was like, I felt, I mean, there was no pressure, but there was like, there was a lot that I didn't know while we were like, I didn't know how long we would be there. I didn't know, like, there was a lot of rescheduling. I actually sent the story that was being written about Black Visions Collective to the members, the 3 members that I was photographing, and then they wanted to change some stuff. And then Kathy Ryan, the editor of the photo editor, was like, that's a no-no. You don't share the story with the subjects. And I had no idea because I'm like, they knew the person, they had spoke with the person who wrote the story about them. And, of course, I'm like, y'all should see the story. And they were like, yeah, we want to change this. This isn't right, or this wasn't how this was. And then it just became a whole thing. But luckily I didn't get into too much trouble. But it was like those types of learning things were like a part of my first editorial job, and me thinking, well, they're definitely going to tell some people that I did this and it's going to keep me from working. But that wasn't the case. It was like I couldn't, let any of those thoughts just keep me from saying yes to editorial work. But I'm also at a point where I'm like, I don't want to do it at every editorial thing that comes, so it's a lot of decision making, just like going into how I know I don't make work, my own work for months and live and marinate, life experience to turn that into something. And also I don't always want to do that. Like a lot of the work that I made during the pandemic wasn't necessarily reflective of that experience right away. But it was definitely something that just like, this is where I am, even making editorial work that wasn't my own throughout the pandemic, and it not being about the pandemic, was very, important. And I would have hated it if it was like everything was about the pandemic, because it is a reality for everyone. It is a reality for everyone, but it's not, there's a lot of escapism that people wanted to continue through that. I mean, we're still in it, but
Absolutely.
but yeah, I don't think it changed like how I work. It's like everything's just like an even pace for me. Just like months of editorial work every now and then, and my own work every now and then. Like I'm not making images like constantly because I'm working on the show where I'm making weavings and drawings, and so my head's like I have images that I haven't even printed out and looked at, but I'm like having to do that now altogether. So it's a lot.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Well,
I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all for attending this week's Visiting Artists Program lecture with D'Angelo. We hope that you enjoyed today's lecture, and we look forward to seeing you again on the 16th with Heidi Norton. Thank you again, D'Angelo.
Thank you all.
Thank you.